Hello and welcome back to our Catechism review. Today we're going to be doing the introduction to the means of grace. So that's on page 281 of your Catechism. It really only goes to page 284. It's a brief little section and it's introducing kind of the next whole section of the Catechism. So we've done the Ten Commandments, the Creed, and the Lord's Prayer, and now the second three parts. There are six chief parts. We've done three. The next three are baptism, confession and absolution, and Holy Communion, or the sacrament of the altar. And those three things are sometimes called the means of grace. And really, sometimes just baptism and communion are called the sacraments or the means of grace. Confession and absolution is also called one, but it's a little bit different because we're going to explain that today. What's the definition of a sacrament or a means of grace? So this is introducing a whole new section of the Catechism, really, because now we're going to be talking about different ways that Christ comes to us. In church, we always talk about the Word and the sacrament, usually meaning Holy Communion in a worship service. But Christ comes to us through the proclaimed Word and then also through these means of grace. So we're not going to talk about any particular one today. We're going to talk about what a sacrament is. And so if you look on the top of page 282, question 293, what is a sacrament? And it gives you kind of a brief definition. It's a sacred act. It's something that you do in church, or it might be called a ritual or a ceremony or a sacred act. And it has to be instituted by Christ. You can't just make up a sacrament. You can't say, well, whenever we do this, that means people's sins are forgiven. It has to be God who initiates it, who invents it, who tells you to do it or institutes it. So that's the first thing. It's a sacred act instituted by God. Secondly, he attaches his word of promise to something physical. So there's something that you can touch or feel that has a promise from God attached to it. And then lastly, by which he forgives sins or gives you his grace and mercy, that means of grace. By means, we simply mean like a vehicle or a method or a way of giving you grace. The word sacrament is a Latin origin word, and it comes from the Greek word for mystery. And sometimes those mysteries are a lot of the things in the Christian faith. People talk about the mystery of how Jesus can be true God and true man, or the mystery of the Trinity. But when we talk about a sacrament in the church, typically we're talking about something like baptism or Holy Communion. So then the question is, how many sacraments are there? Question 294. And we say that we don't really give an official number. Some people say 2, baptism and Holy Communion. Some people say 3, baptism, confession, absolution, and Holy Communion. Normally, in some other churches, they talk about having 7 sacraments because they add confirmation or marriage or ordination or last rites. And we do all of those things. We have confirmation, we do weddings, we do the equivalent of last rites and ordination. We just don't call them sacraments, and we'll explain a little bit why that is, but it has to do with that definition of, is it instituted by God? Does he attach his grace to something physical? And does he give you the forgiveness of sins won by Christ through it? So I'm going to explain what it means because the sacraments become really important to the church. But a lot of people think, well, it's just a ritual. It's just something that you do. It can't possibly have spiritual significance and reality. So I'm going to try to give an example, and I do this in class. You probably remember right before all this happened, I gave everybody in class $1 if you were in class. But the idea is, how can you attach a promise to something physical? So in class, I gave everybody a dollar bill and a Monopoly dollar and said, which one's real? Well, obviously everybody knew the real dollar was the real dollar, but why? They're both just paper and ink. It's not that a real dollar has really valuable paper. What is it that makes a real dollar real and a Monopoly dollar not real. And it's because there is a valid promise attached to the real dollar. It's instituted by the government. The promise is attached to something physical, and it carries with it then the thing that is promised. So if I give you $1, I'm actually giving you $1. If I give you a Monopoly dollar, I'm just giving you a symbol of $1, which isn't worth anything. So today I want to try to illustrate the same thing using my checkbook here. So I've got checks. And if I were to write you a check, it would suddenly, this piece of paper, I could suddenly make that piece of paper, which is just a little rectangular piece of paper. I've got all kinds of little rectangular pieces of paper that are worthless sitting around here. I could take this worthless piece of paper and turn it into something worth $100, because this is instituted by the bank and by me, and if I signed it and wrote it out to you, suddenly that piece of paper would be worth the promise that I put on it. Now, for that to be real, I have to have money in my bank. If I don't have any money in my bank account, I'm writing bad checks. So I have to have money in the bank, and then I have to have an official check. I can't just write that on a Post-it note or a scrap page. It has to be instituted by the bank and me that this is the way we're going to get money out of the bank. We decided that. We can't just make it up as we go along. It has to have my signature attached to it. And then, really, for it to do you any good, you have to believe it. If I write you a check and you just think it's a piece of paper and you use it as a bookmark, it doesn't do you any good. So you have to have all those four things. You have to have money in the account. You have to have something that attaches that money in the account to something physical, the promise that I can give it to you. And then you have to receive that in faith. And it's the same way with the sacraments. The money in the account, so to speak, is Christ's death and resurrection. That's really what is saving you. That's God's mercy and grace. That event is like the infinite dollar amount sacrifice that is worth everything. The question is, how is it applied to you? How does God give it to you? And so he attaches the promise that Christ won for you, full forgiveness and new life, and he attaches it to something physical, instituted by him. Just like the check was instituted by me and the bank, it's instituted by God to take what Christ did for you and apply it to you, give it to you. And baptism and Holy Communion are then taking that and applying it directly, physically to you, but it's real. It's not just some symbolic thing that we do to remind us of Jesus. Just like, this isn't just something that reminds you of money. When it's signed and made out to you, it is money. And baptism isn't just something that sort of makes you think about Jesus. It's God putting Jesus on you. Holy Communion isn't just something that reminds you of Jesus. It is the body and blood of Christ being given and shed for you. It is real, not because the water of baptism is magical, but because there's a promise attached to it. Just like in this check, this paper doesn't suddenly become worth $100 because it's magic paper. It's because I attached that promise to it. So when we talk about the sacraments, we got to remember that we're always talking about, yes, it's just water. Yes, it's just bread and wine. If you look at it chemically, if you look at it in terms of its physical properties, but God takes it and attaches a promise to it. He attaches this particular water or this particular bread and wine to what Christ did for you on the cross and applies it to you. So that's what's going on in the sacraments, is that they are real in the sense that God's promise is trustworthy. And when he says, this is my body, that means through that bread, he's giving you his body. This is my blood. Through that wine, he's giving you his blood. He is adopting you into his family through this water of baptism, because that's what the promise is, instituted by God. So as we go through the sacraments, I kind of want you to have in mind that idea of a promise attached to something physical, like signing a check takes regular old paper and makes it suddenly, the real thing, or the government making money. God is taking regular old water, regular old things, and saying, because I instituted this way of giving you the grace won for you by Jesus Christ, and I signed my name, attached my promise to it, and gave it to you, you are getting Jesus Christ through this means of grace. And we'll bear that in mind and now as we go through the rest of the Catechism. Thanks.